Hi, welcome to what will be the first of a series of small videos, in this case for connectionism. I'd like to begin not by presenting new material, but by going over the last example we discussed in class, because in many respects it's the most important example of the entire course. And if you have fully taken on board the lesson of this, you will have a great deal of what this module sets out to accomplish. The topic in question is the manner in which connectionist modelers use their craft in order to contribute to discussions going on in this case, developmental psychology. The broad topic is the acquisition of linguistic categories. This is a specific example, and there's a lot of work in other forms of categorical learning, but language, because it is characterized in terms of strong categorical oppositions, like between phonemes and words, has been of intense interest to developmental psychologists and more recently, of course, to connectionists. The reason that these battles have been fought here is that the developmental data often suggest a path in which young developing people go through a series of stages, and some stages look qualitatively different from others. We're familiar with this from the work of the developmental psychologist Jean Piaget, who describes strict sequencing in the manner in which we develop our cognitive grasp of the world. That lends itself to this form of pseudo-explanation in which we simply say, I see the developing subject has transitioned from one stage to another stage and is now doing something differently. And connectionists are very keen to put the brakes on that kind of explanation and to say instead, look, rather than suggesting that the inner economy, the brain, reorganizes itself or does something completely different in one situation than another, perhaps we should instead let the complexity of the world carry some weight here and look to see to what extent generic learning mechanisms may give rise to highly differentiated capacities and structures when the interaction with the world is sufficiently informative and rich. So the discussion is rooted in categorical perception. Categorical perception is a very specific term. We discussed this in lectures, but in order to demonstrate categorical perception, that someone has achieved categorical perception or is exhibiting categorical perception, there must be, of course, two or more categories. We must be able to construct stimuli or probes which lie at different points along some kind of a continuum, whereas there's a threshold, and on one side of it, you assume is category A, and the other side is category B. If we now have two stimuli which are physically distinct, but they lie within one category, people would be expected to be bad at differentiating them. But two stimuli equally physically dissimilar, which straddle the category boundary, would appear to be different, would be perceived as being different. And so in order to get categorical perception, we need to show bad discrimination within category, good discrimination across the category boundary, and if we play as stimuli drawn from a larger continuum, then we should get variable responses only around the category boundary. Once we're clearly on one side or the other of the category boundary, people should respond in a single manner. Here's some data showing the acquisition of phonological categories by infants. In the top panel, we have a contrast between infants who will grow up to learn English and infants who will grow up to learn Japanese. And at 7 months, we see that the sound distinction being studied here, which is between ra and la, is equally interesting or equally well discriminated by all the infants at 7 months, but by 11 months, the English learning infants have got very good at telling these two sounds apart, ra and la. And the Japanese learning infants have got very bad at it. Now, in order to make sense of what's going on here, we need to know that these sounds, ra and la, are categorically different if you're an English speaker and are categorically the same if you're a Japanese speaker. Ra and la belong to the same category. We see it illustrated for Chinese below. I'm a little bit more cautious about pronouncing these, but ci and ci. There's a contrast here which is phonemic in Mandarin, but not in English. At 7 months, English learning and Mandarin learning infants respond similarly to these contrasts. Over time, by 11 months, the Mandarin learning infants have got very good at making this contrast, and the English learning infants, myself included, are very bad at it. So this is the general field of categorical perception. It's got a tight definition, and it's not simply the matter of, oh, we perceive categories, but categorical perception requires these 3 distinguishing characteristics: insensitivity to discriminations within a category, sensitivity to discriminations of similar magnitude across category boundaries, and an abrupt shift in labeling at category boundaries. Here's an example of how one might construct a stimulus continuum, where if we were studying the distinction between ta and da, for example, 2 sounds which are categorically distinct in English, and they differ. One way that they can be made to differ is by changing the length of what's called the voice onset time, which is the amount of time between the release of the stop and the onset of voicing, shown here as VOT. Ta will have a long voice onset time. Da will have a voice onset time of about 0. And we can construct stimuli that have intermediate voice onset times. And down in the bottom right, you can see that there's a clear category here. Everything, when the voice onset times are very short, everyone perceives da. When they're very long, everyone perceives ta. And right around the middle, the responses to this are very variable. Now, I want to get on to the Schaffer and Marshall paper, who undertook a connectionist investigation of some work in developmental psychology. And we need to understand clearly the different roles played by the infants, by the developmental psychologists, by the connectionist modelers, and by the neural networks themselves. All these 4 play different roles here, and if we confuse them, we fail to understand what the work is about. The developmental psychologists have done some prior work here showing that 8-month-old infants can make some discriminations that 14-month-old infants appear not to be making. This is precisely of a kind with the data we were just looking at, and suggests that there's a qualitative shift in whatever it is that the infants are doing in this period. Perhaps transitioning, in Piaget's language, we would say they're transitioning from one kind of processing stage to another. The original work by the developmental psychologists is by Stager and Werker. And in this work, they were looking at infants who were presented with a combination of a sound, like blork, and an image, like this orange monster. Initially, infants are, first of all, they learn the association between this sound and this image. They learn that this is a blork, and after a while, that becomes uninteresting to them. And then we give them a trial in which we change the sound, blorg, for example, and look to see, do they appear to notice? Do they notice that the sound is now different, even though the image is the same? And the developmental psychologists have a challenge here. They have to operationalize the notion of noticing. They have to say what it is for someone to notice the difference. And in this instance, they're paying attention to how long the infants remain looking at the image. And they look at the difference between the looking time on a switch trial when the sound changed, and the looking time on the same trial when the sound didn't change, in order to operationalize the notion of noticing. So this is something that the developmental psychologists implemented. And they got results like these. There are 5 experiments shown here. We're going to be concerned mainly with experiments 2 to 4. Experiment 2, shown here with the red outline, is very important in this. The 8-month-old infants in a trial like this, when we present words together with, or sounds together with images, are sensitive to the difference between bit and di. 14-month-olds are not. So it seems like they've lost this sensitivity. Now, the 14-month-olds are well capable of making the auditory discrimination in a different context. Specifically, if we change the task so it is no longer an association between a word and an image, but we simply have them look at a neutral visual stimulus, in this case a checkerboard, we find that they are sensitive to the difference between bit and di. So it's not that they can't tell, it's almost like they choose not to tell. If in the context of the image discrimination, of the word image pairing, we make the sound difference bigger, like between lif and neem, then they clearly notice the difference. So there's a bit of a puzzle here in that there's an auditory distinction which the 14-month-old infants are capable of making in some task contexts, but they don't show it in the image sound pairing. And the developmental psychologists, and we're still with the developmental psychologists, they came up with this account. 8-month-old infants were learning fine phonetic detail of the language that indexes specific language-specific contrasts. And the 14-month-old infants were hypothesized to be sort of over that. They've done all that, and now they're learning that these words relate to things. We're learning to name things, which is an astonishingly interesting power to acquire. And the fact that they're now doing a different task biases the perceptual system differently and accounts for the difference. So on the developmental psychologist's account, there's a functional reorganization somewhere between 8 and 14 months, prior to which the infants are understood as to be learning phonetic details of the language, after which they're learning the relation between languages, between words and worlds. And this is exactly the kind of account in which connectionists come in and say, hang on, maybe there's no functional reorganization going on at all. Maybe this is what will happen if you learn in a sufficiently rich world using fairly generic learning mechanisms. So Schaefer and Marshall, who are connectionists now, not developmental psychologists, they come along and they attempt to show that change in behavior doesn't necessarily require a change in processing mechanisms. So they're going to use one processing mechanism, which is training a neural network. They're going to themselves operationalize the distinctions that the developmental psychologists are using. So the developmental psychologists had to decide how to operationalize the notion of noticing in babies. And the connectionists now come along and they have to map from the world of the babies and developmental psychologists into the world of neural networks and present a method then for modeling habituation phenomena in interests. And when they do so, they may be able to make some predictions. The reason that they're interested in this is that if they can show that generic learning mechanisms can reproduce these kind of data findings without a functional reorganization, then the kind of account that the developmental psychologists are producing seems unnecessary. Now, how do the connectionists go about modeling the task of the infants? So here's, I want you to understand that the connectionists are making some creative leaps here and mapping between two entirely different domains, the worlds of infants and developmental psychologists, into the world of neural networks. They're going to construct this mapping using the following assumption. They're going to assume that when infants are presented with an object, like an orange monster, that they compare the stimulus with an internal representation, and if there's a mismatch because it's new, novel, or odd, then that's going to require an update of the internal representation. and that update will be more severe as a mismatch is more severe. The kind of network they're going to use is an auto-associator, which we've met in class and you've played with in labs. These, of course, simply take their input and map them to the output. The input units are going to be divided into two groups, one set of 18 units to represent the word or sound, and one set of 18 units to represent the image or object. These 36 units are then compressed down onto 18 hidden units and then re-expanded at the output. The training cycles that the network is subjected to are going to correspond to the time taken to develop an internal representation. That's a conscious decision made by the modelers. The error displayed at the output is going to correspond to the looking time. That is, if everything that we present to the network is entirely of a piece with what the network has seen before, it should be able to reproduce the input at the output with no error. If we change something now, that will produce a change at the output, which we will register as network error. So the idea is that network error will correspond to looking time. Now we've got to consider the situation of the infants as they do the task. First of all, infants have a lot of exposure to their ambient language, and then they're taken into the laboratory with the developmental psychologist, and they go through this habituation phase, and then they're tested. All of this requires consideration in constructing a connectionist model. So we start off by modeling the prior exposure. An 8-month-old is different from a 14-month-old by training the networks to auto-associate 240 label object pairs. And the young networks, those corresponding to the 8-month-old infants, will be trained for 1,000 trials. And the older networks will be trained for 10,000 trials. And those numbers are arbitrary. But it's important that one is a lot less than the other. In this sense, we have networks which one set of networks have less experience of the data than the others. Now we need to consider how to represent sounds and images. Luckily, in the domain of sound, we have a well-developed theory of representation from English phonology. All the sounds are going to be consonant, vowel, consonant, or CVC syllables. We're going to use 18 units for the syllable as a whole, so 6 units to represent each of the 3 segments. And each of those 6 units will be a switch which is on or off, depending on whether or not a specific feature is present. So the first feature will be, is it a consonant? That's a 1 for a consonant and a 0 for a vowel. Then we can dive down and develop representations that capture the contrasts of English phonemes, the manner in which sounds are produced, the place in which they're produced. We have a lot of experience in this domain. Phonology is a domain we've met before. There's the International Phonetic Alphabet showing that it's a systematically organized domain. Here, this is just for the consonants. Elements are defined by their position within a systematic structure of oppositions. And this gives us a means of creating principled vectors in which things that are similar, so p and b, for example, or t and d, are represented very similarly. And things which are very distinct, like lif and neem, for example, will have very different vectors. So that's going to be for the labels. What are we going to do for the objects? What's a connectionist representation of a little orange monster, an image of a little orange monster? Well, the answer is there is none. And this, we're going to have to make some ad hoc decisions. We're going to basically take random 18-bit vectors. Here's an 18-bit vector. Let's just call that an object. Associate it with a particular word. And on those trials where, remember that the switch trials involve a change to the sound, but not a change to the object. So we'll just keep the 18-bit pattern for the image constant and make a change to the sound. We will also want to model the experimental contrast in which the infants are looking at a checkerboard, so there's no image. And for that, we'll set all the object bits to 0.5, so there's nothing unique, specific, or interesting about that particular vector. And in this manner, we construct carefully a mapping between the experimental conditions of the experimental psychologist and the training regime of a neural network. And here are the results. On the top left, you see the results from the infants that we're shadowing. We looked at those before. And down on the bottom right, you see the results in, bottom right is the infant results, top left is the model results. So in the model, we're measuring the mean error at the outputs on same and different trials. With the infants we were modeling, we were measuring how long they looked at something. And there's a remarkable correspondence between the results from the network and the results from the infants. So for the correspondence to experiment 2 showed that the young networks that were only trained for 1,000 cycles seem to be sensitive, that is, the error goes up when we make a small change to the sound. The older ones don't show that, but they do show it if we have a greater change to the sound. And if we remove the object vector and just replace it with all 0.5s, then the sound change alone is enough to cause a marked increase in error. What should we make of this? Well, on the one hand, this shows that we have a framework in which we can draw comparisons between what goes on in the lab of the developmental psychologist and what goes on in the neural network simulator. At either end, of course, we've got the infant who may be doing something that is entirely out of whack with what the psychologists think, and we've got the network. And we have to be cautious because I'm not sure we're interpreting the network correctly. The point of this exercise is to make it perfectly explicit how many decisions are involved as we go from the laboratory of the developmental psychologist, who has already made lots of operationalization decisions in how to interpret an infant. An infant doesn't interpret itself. So the developmental psychologist starts measuring things like looking time. And the connectionist comes along and maps onto connectionist networks in a fashion that makes some kind of sense, and it's up to us to decide whether that is good sense or bad sense. Some of the parameter fittings here is completely ad hoc. So 1,000 trials for a young network or 10,000 trials for an old network, these are pulled out of the air. What's important is that there's a contrast there. The substitution of these bit patterns for sounds and images has consequences. And as we examine and critically consider such work, we need to carefully distinguish between the roles of the developmental psychologist, the network modeler, and the infant. They don't necessarily understand things in comparable ways. This single example is worth your attention. It serves to illuminate the way in which connectionist modeling can be brought to bear in helping to contribute to debates about human development. Here, the underlying theoretical question is, do we need to posit a fundamental difference in learning in order to get this kind of differentiated result? Connectionists have made some kind of argument that we don't, whereas the developmental psychologists had said we do based on the infant data. These arguments persist, and it's a messy business, and we won't be able to make sense of it if we're not very clear about who is doing what. Right, that's that one.